Caradee is really brilliantly qualified to speak to us, and really grateful that she's agreed to do so. And Caradee is going to obviously talk in fairly broad terms today about her work in climate and climate change impacts on health. But I'll let her tell you about it all. So, Caradee, over to you. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Neville, for the introduction. Hello to everybody who's joining today. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. And
Okay.
before you go, I just want to check that, Inga, are we recording this?
Yes, yes, I started the recording just now.
Thank you. Okay, cool.
All right, so I'm then going to share my screen. I'm going to quickly close my email so that nobody bothers me.
Yeah.
And share my screen. And go to full screen mode. There we go.
Gotcha. Thanks.
Okay, great. So thanks for the invitation to speak today. I am going to focus on a manuscript that we published last year, which was a collaboration between the University of Pretoria and a professor that I work with in Edinburgh, Mary Norville. So we did a narrative review looking at the major climate change induced risks to human health in South Africa. And what I thought I'd do is give you sort of an overview of this manuscript. If you want more of the detail, I invite you to go and have a read of it. But I'll also give some anecdotal evidence and some of our research experience in the different sections as we go. So the manuscript was published last year in Environmental Health Research. And by way of introduction, I just need to get this little box out the way. This is a very busy slide, but essentially it's nice to look at the little infographics. There are a wealth of impacts on health and well-being, and it's important that we consider the World Health Organization's definition of health or human health that includes the psychological well-being of people, because climate change is going to and is already impacting on those aspects of health as well as the physiological aspects. So we can see a range of direct and indirect impacts from climate variability or change or meteorological events or extreme weather events, for example. So mostly those at the top are the direct impacts. So for example, we've got vector-borne disease that's going to feature a bit today. This is usually through a vector that carries the pathogen or whatever virus they may have that then passes on to a human via the vector. And down the other end, we've got occupational health and lost productivity. That could be because somebody's workplace is flooded and they can't go to work anymore and work can't pay them. And at the bottom, we've got more of the indirect effects. So we know that climate change, for example, alters temperature and rainfall, the conditions that are required for crop production. And this has a negative effect in terms of crop yields if the conditions aren't right, which can lead to a number of things relating to food insecurity. Also malnutrition and child stunting, which is unfortunately a major problem in South Africa at the moment. So that's just a summary of all of the impacts that we're seeing in South Africa from climate change. But I'll zoom in to a few specific ones now from the manuscript. I just need to know how to move my page, which at the moment is not working. Maybe if I click. There we go. All right, so usually we start these manuscripts with a good understanding of South Africa in context. So on the left-hand side, we've got a map showing the different parts of South Africa from a, can't remember what the word is now, my geography is eluding me. Doesn't matter. It's showing different...
Topographical.
Well, is it topographical? Because is that the one that... I don't know. Anyway, it's that one that shows height variation. And we can see that we've got coastal plains and we've got a high veld, we've got mountains around the Sutu. And essentially, quite varying conditions across the country, but from west to east and north to south. And we also try and understand the population characteristics of South Africa, because of course these affect how people can cope or not just physiologically respond to the impacts of climate change, but how they can apply resilience to be able to adapt and cope in climate change contexts. So South Africa has quite a large population. We also have a large number of international immigrants. Our life expectancy is relatively low still compared to other countries, even though it's improved over the years. We still have a reasonably high death rate, unfortunately, from HIV/AIDS, as well as a number of deaths from TB, as well as a number of active cases of TB, which increases the vulnerability for people with pre-existing disease. We have a high unemployment rate. Note that that's for a specific age range. That's why it doesn't look like the one that the country states as 24 to 25%. And that's for a specific age range. And someone trying to speak to me.
No, qué bueno.
Oh, someone's just not on mute.
Qué bueno,
Sorry, whoever that is, I think it's Malebo. You need to mute. Okay, we're done.
There we go.
Carry
All
on.
right. Great. Okay, and then two very important ones. The one is looking at people living in poverty. So we have more than half of our population in South Africa who are living in indigent communities with a lack of services and usually unemployed, and this all increases their risks both to climate change because of where they are situated, usually in spaces that are potentially at risk of flooding, for example, on floodplains or on riverbanks. And the second one is education attainment, and there we see that there are not a substantial part of the population of South Africa who are educated beyond matric. And so all of these combined make the complexities of understanding climate change and human health because of socioeconomic and demographic factors more complicated to try and unravel. I wanted to put this one up first just so that we could have a look at what the South African Presidential Climate Commission, who was called into effect a few years ago, might not even be years yet, but they recommend stronger nationally determined contribution mitigation target ranges. So we know that we're aiming towards 1.5 degrees globally, and they're trying to get a target close to that. And they have plotted this historically, that's the black line. And then they've got the sort of wide range of uncertainty with the policies and actions they're hoping to implement in South Africa. The Commission's recommended range of what is required in terms of reduction of carbon dioxide specifically from South Africa, and how we could potentially get to reach the updated nationally determined contribution with a more stringent emission reduction. And this really is a slide that shows us a complexity, because not only is climate change and health really a health issue, climate change itself being a health issue because that's where the impacts are, but it's extremely connected with development and with the economy. And so the Commission's work around the transition to a just transition or just energy transition, trying to get us away from burning of coal or fossil fuels for power towards renewable energy sources, is not an easy task, but is one that is desirable to help us reach these new levels of compliance. So just with that in mind, if we think about what some of the recent and future climate changes in South Africa and their impacts on health and behavior might be, I think just first off, looking at this slide, that we can't say anymore that South Africans are not aware of climate change. Maybe not all South Africans are, but there is definitely a growing group of South Africans who are very much aware and concerned about climate change for our country and for Earth as a planet. So there have been a number of marches, for example, this one, and there are also some activists, young people particularly, who are very much trying to advocate for change, for a better future for them. So if we look then at what are the impacts that have been considered in South Africa and the ones that we thought about in this paper specifically, first of all, obviously, is global heating. So this is causing temperatures to rise, and the related immediate heat related impact that one thinks of as heat stress. It's not like normal stress where you may be anxious over exams. Heat stress is a different type of stress. So the symptoms are usually headaches, muscle cramps. You may experience extreme sweating and faint. You could faint, and nausea. And this type of heat stress, we are seeing more cases reported to hospitals during the extreme heat wave events that we have. And usually we seem to be having them in September, October of each year in the last few years. And then we dive into, at least in Gauteng, the wettest summer again. It's nice to see the sun today, but we've had a lot of rain. So in the manuscript, we speak about how mean annual temperature has already been shown to have increased in the past 50 years, and that it is projected to rise in the future based on a combination of models. So not just a single climate model, but a grouping of models to try and get better accuracy. Those plots on the bottom right are showing graphs that indicate change, not actual temperature. So it might look, well, we're going from red to blue, but from A, B, C to D, which is the furthest in the future. But that's not the case. The number of hot days and very hot days are actually likely to increase in a number of places across the African continent, especially down south in the southern region. So there we've got projected changes in the number of heat days. So it's a +1 or a +2 or a +3. You can see that for the city of Johannesburg, for example, it's quite a large range, but it's from about 81 to as many as 296 days in a year where we would be seeing extreme hot days. And this, I think, if I remember correctly, was over 32 degrees Celsius. That's by the end of this century. 296 days is really almost the total of a year, 365. So, and I can't remember exactly which projection was being used for these plots, but you can refer to the manuscript for that. So we're also expecting that heat wave frequency will increase. Some work done by the South African Weather Service is showing us that. And heat effects or temperature effects, especially when temperature is high, affects morbidity. So heat-related illnesses. So heat can exacerbate cardiovascular and respiratory diseases, as well as the impacts that it has on people with pre-existing diseases. So someone with, for example, with asthma, or somebody who is struggling with any condition, in fact, when they're placed in a heat-stressed environment, that condition can be exacerbated, or increased heart rate, and so on. So the increase, for example, in ischemic heart disease and stroke. So high temperature essentially can also affect mortality. Some work that we've done has shown, based on historical records of about 20 years of deaths, about 3.4% of all deaths could be attributed to temperature hot or very hot, or temperature very cold. That seems like a small amount, but when the numbers come out, it's in the order of hundreds of thousands of people who died because of temperature being too hot or too cold. Then if we think about temperature rise in outdoor workers face these challenges related to heat because they're really outside, especially if they're not covered in any way with any sort of awning. They're directly exposed to solar radiation, which is the source of the infrared, which is causing the heat. and indirectly post-exposure, for example, when they go home and suddenly they're really feeling terrible, they actually have a form of sunstroke, and this means that they can't go to work the next day. So it has a knock-on effect of productivity. We have a large sector of outdoor workers in the country, from forestry, conservation, and so on, as well as our mining sector. And the impacts on outdoor workers from heat include, again, heat stress, dehydration, heat exhaustion. Those are just some of the symptomatic effects. And then the more severe ones I mentioned before. And in order to solve this particular problem for outdoor workers, it really requires the employer and the employee to work together to find solutions. So here in the Northern Cape, these women are working in an area to remove non-Indigenous plants, and they've got hats, but they've also got very thick clothing, the protective clothing from the sun, but it's very thick. There's one person who's not wearing anything. She's just got wearing a shirt with no sleeves to keep cool. So it's this sort of personal protective equipment toss-off of whether you're cool and you're protected, or you have all the covering and you're hot. And we've got to work out ways to figure out what's the best solution for those. Then we've got the concept of vulnerability in temperature rise and global heating. So certain groups are more vulnerable for the risks of temperature-related health impacts. I've alluded to some of these: people with pre-existing diseases. So it's not just the impact of the temperature itself that somebody's feeling, but also if it's extremely hot outside, you're less likely to be willing to get out of your house, walk to somewhere, to get a taxi, to get to a clinic, to stand in a queue to get your medication. This is a huge problem. If somebody is not well and it's very hot, it may be that they choose not to go and get care on that particular day, which could offset unfortunate consequences. We've also got some concerns around mother-to-child HIV transmission, which we've done very well with in the country. We could have a little bit of a revert back here, and that's fully explained in the manuscript. I'm aware of time, so I don't want to go into the details of that. We also have indigent communities with social, nutrition, and housing challenges and problems. I mentioned that in the very beginning. So people whose homes are built in land which is susceptible to extreme flooding, other people who are living in areas where there's drought. These all have knock-on effects in terms of food security, which then affects nutrition. And then just in general, infants, children, and the elderly are especially vulnerable to temperature rise because they can't help themselves. They require people mostly, especially the elderly who may be unwell, they need assistance from others and guidance from others, and that needs to be provided in a way that's useful, and that the people who are being tasked to do so have the agency and the ability to actually help infants, children, and the elderly. So just something we've noticed up north in the northeast of the country, where it's very, very hot. The tradition is to swaddle your baby, but in actual fact, it would be better to take the baby out of all the layers of blankets and just let the baby be in a vest. The baby isn't going to get sick because it's 37 degrees Celsius. They're going to avoid dehydration. And as long as they're in the shade, they aren't going to get sunburned. And it would be much more beneficial than them being wrapped in many, many layers and overheating. Then we've got temperature rise in relation to how it affects malaria. So 95% of our malaria infections are caused by one specific protozoa, and it's transmitted to humans by the bite of the female of that name mosquito, which is indigenous to malaria regions in South Africa. And the evidence that we have around malaria is the transmission is highest in the wet summer months, with conditions that favor the development of both the vector and the protozoa, plus the frequency of biting and feeding of the vector. And there's some evidence to suggest that the modeling work shows a shift could take place in malaria from the west to the south and the eastern parts of the country. That doesn't really make sense because we don't have malaria in the west. West. I'll have to check that. We'll have to check that. But in other words, we could see a change in where malaria areas typically have been in the past and where they will be in the future. We have a concern for other infectious diseases. Most of these are also carried by a vector such as a mosquito. So arbovirus carried by mosquitoes, which cause dengue fever. There's a possibility of us seeing more of that in South Africa. Rift Valley fever we have seen affecting humans as well as domestic animals and sheep, also carried by mosquitoes. West Nile fever virus, and this is carried by migratory birds. So change in habitat where those birds usually reside will then increase the likelihood of us seeing this virus. And again, from the bird to the mosquito to the human is the pathway. Increase in tick-borne diseases, so Crimean Congo hemorrhagic fever, and then schistosomiasis bilharzia, which most of us are already familiar with, because of the changes in rainfall patterns. So whether it's been extremely heavy rain or whether we've had a little bit of rain and there's stagnant water and the right conditions for where these protozoa to mosquito relationships take place, we'll see a change in these infectious diseases. I think most people are familiar with the heavy rainfall that we saw in KwaZulu-Natal. So rainfall in South Africa, just in general, is typically really variable in time, area, and distribution. So we know that the Western Cape's rain is very different to KwaZulu-Natal or the Highveld. But we're seeing some changes in these patterns over the years. So we've got not only to think about what would be normal, but we also have things like the tropical cyclones that come in it from over Mozambique, and then, of course, extreme flooding in the north and eastern parts of the country. And then we have seen some tragic consequences, loss of life, especially from flash floods from our summer convective storms, especially up on the Highveld. So these impacts can be as severe as drowning and loss of life, but they also are loss of possessions, dwellings, livelihoods, which have incredible both physiological and psychological impacts on people. And then the health effects from a lack of water and lack of sanitation and food, as well as, I think it might come just now, but the transmission of things like cholera, for example, when there's a mixing of sewage and contaminated water, for example. In the instance of drought, which is the opposite, they are projected to likely increase over the southern and eastern parts of the country and have a range of impacts. I mentioned these in the beginning. Malnutrition and stunting are particular big concerns in South Africa. During lockdown, this was a very large worry because many children in South Africa are fed through the national school feeding programs, and that's the only meal that they really get in a day. So it's a really important one. We've got to make sure that children can still get to school. But drought is also linked with diarrheal disease risk, so is flooding. But in the instance of drought, when there's a lack of water available, this can lead to waterborne and water wash diseases because there's just not sufficient water for keeping up with our water and safety and sanitation and hygiene practices. And of course, the economic losses from drought are severe. Then if we have a look at dust storms, we're seeing we're potentially seeing an increase in these. It could just be because people are more aware of them and social media and the media are reporting on them. But these occur from a combination of really strong winds and loose, dry soil surfaces in arid and semi-arid parts of the country. As I said, we're seeing more and more of these. We don't know whether it is because there are more. It's just an artifact of us seeing more through the media. But they definitely have impacts on reduced visibility, which can lead to traffic accidents. And then they have respiratory symptom impacts, as well as affecting the eyes. And we've tried to do some work connecting the dots here between admissions at hospitals during and after dust storms, but we don't have enough data to show the evidence connecting the two yet in South Africa. A nice study waiting to happen. Then we'll have a look at how does climate change link with ambient and household air pollution? So ambient or outdoor air pollution is a mixture of sources. So this is both from coal-fired power stations, transport sector, industry, the background dust. Africa is known as a dusty continent, and where we've got unpaved roads or untarred roads, where there will be an increase of dust. And we've got a number of pollutants of concern, which are called our criteria pollutants, which are managed by our National Ambient Air Quality Standards and our National Air Quality Officer. Our household air pollution stems from the burning of dirty fuels for cooking and for heating. So this is an instance where people have electricity access but can't afford it, or choose not to use it and rather use a traditional form of cooking, for example, because it tastes better for them. And these fuels, wood, coal, dung, paraffin, and biomass, and other products that are burnt. In the instance at the bottom, the fire has been made outside in the Mbala, and then they bring that fire inside once the smoke has gone down. That may reduce the particulates from the smoke, from the fire and the smoke, but it still, unfortunately, does lead to household air pollution from other pollutants in the home. This is a major problem in South Africa, air pollution, both ambient and household. Of course, household contributes to the outside air pollution as well. And there was, in fact, the very first court case that was won for the breach of the right to a clean, healthy environment. That's the Deadly Air case, where Groundwork, the Centre for Environmental Rights, and others took the Departments of Forestry, Fisheries and Environment to court for the breach of that constitutional right on the Highveld, for the Highveld priority area in South Africa. So if you Google that on the news, it's a really interesting case. And the Departments of Environment and Health are now very much being put in a difficult situation to show what they're going to do to make change. What we really do need here is increasing health information to inform our impacts, the impacts that it's having on health. A number of different studies have been done, but having actual data, not model data, would be useful. And then there's also challenges with getting air quality data, because we don't have monitoring stations everywhere. Can use satellite data, but it's not always at the breathing zone, which is where we want it when we do epidemiological work. Then I think I'm almost done. Air pollution and interactions with climate change. So this does occur. So climate change and air pollution do influence each other. So increase in temperatures, for example, create different conditions in the atmosphere, which can increase the formation of tropospheric ozone. Particular pollutants can also, if there's for example, NO2, it can also influence how much tropospheric ozone there is. And climate change can also influence particulate matter, especially the very, very fine particulate matter that can be inhaled deeply into the lungs. The changes in the meteorology from climate change also has knock-on effects in terms of impacts on air pollution. So, for example, changes in biomass burning or in fire regimes because of extreme droughts or lack of water all affect air pollution. But then there are definite co-benefits of decarbonization for our economy. And in fact, by reducing our sulfur dioxide and carbon dioxide emissions, we would see an improvement in air pollution in the country and consequently health effects. So lastly, the actions that are required to ameliorate the impacts on health. This is a very, very simplified 3 bullet points. It's way more complicated than this, but there's a role for the health sector to play, obviously, but it cannot be done alone. All other sectors, from housing and development, roads and transport, all the way across, every government department not working in silos, have a part to play to make sure that we protect human health. We need to give a lot more attention to preparedness, disaster risk management, and then of course public awareness. And we need education, training, and capacity for those people who are in positions where they can assist people who are being impacted by the effects of climate change and air pollution. And just to finish, it's really important, I know there's a lot of students potentially listening today, that your research doesn't stop at the end of a research article. So I've presented to you some of the findings of our article that we brought together in a review, but at the same time, we've also translated those into flyers, which recently were distributed nationwide by the National Department of Health when we had the extreme heat weather in September, October, and there was a dust storm event, and that was also distributed in the Northwest Province. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Caradee. I will start by saying firstly that I think the SIMP paper is a really important one because it really does put a stake in the ground and explain the scope of the challenge of climate change and health. And I think it's a really useful contribution. Like one point, you were worried about the point about malaria from the west. Of course, it's not the west of South Africa, but certainly from Angola, from Namibia, that's an important source, and of course also from the east, as we know. And then I think what you've illustrated so well is that climate change is not just obvious and direct, but it's also quite insidious. And I think you make the point that how it impacts on people either like physiologically or in terms of illness, but also the livelihoods. And the livelihood impacts of climate change is also a health issue. And that's the sort of insidious path or the indirect path, which is really, really important to consider. So it's welfare, it's health and welfare. And, welfare at the end of the day determines health. Just one question for you, which might be a spurious one, and that is the relationship between skin conditions, and in particular cancers, and climate change. Now, there may or may not be one, but I'd be interested to know what your thoughts are on that, and then we'll open to the floor.
Okay.
Thanks.
So yeah, thanks, Neville. So I specifically left that out. So we do discuss that in the manuscript. I don't know if you're doing that to me just to be mean, or whether you're really interested.
I'm really interested.
All right. So we have skin cancer as one of our top 10 cancers in South Africa. Skin cancer is made up of cutaneous melanoma and then keratinocyte skin cancers. The cutaneous melanoma can be fatal if it's not caught very, very early. And the keratinocyte cancers are usually very disfiguring. They can be very uncomfortable, but they do not cause death. So these occur across all of our population groups in the country, but not all of these conditions are caused by solar ultraviolet radiation. So not the heat component of the sun, the infrared, but the solar radiation that's the UV spectrum. And particularly among Black African individuals, solar UV radiation is unlikely, based on the evidence that we have so far globally, to be the reason for melanoma or keratinocyte cancers. There may be a little bit for basal cell, but not for squamous cell or for melanoma. What the challenges for people who are at risk of those cancers in a changing climate is that people who are susceptible to skin cancer, where solar UV radiation is the risk factor, people may take part in activities to try and cool down in extreme heat that takes them outdoors more than they necessarily would be. So they may go swimming, they may try and find shady areas to do recreation, but not all shade is actually protective. And in those instances, they're increasing their exposure. They may remove clothing so that more of their body and their skin is exposed, and that then could increase the skin's exposure to solar UV radiation, increase the risk of erythema or sunburn, and that then would increase the risk of skin cancer later on in life. The work that's been done so far has not been done in South Africa, but this has been done overseas in the US, where they've looked at whether there's a relationship between an increase in temperature and an increase in skin cancers. There is a little bit of evidence of that for the keratinocyte cancers, not for the the melanomas, which are the ones that are most fatal. But I guess essentially the jury is still out about how skin conditions may be affected. I do want to make mention not necessarily to skin cancer, but to other skin conditions, of which there are many, that will potentially be affected because of climate change. And some of these actually relate indirectly through the lack of water for hygiene. So yes, we do have to be concerned about the skin.
Thank you. And I mean, even excessive sweating you mentioned, and various other ways. Yeah, thank you. Let me see if there's anyone in the meeting who would like to make a comment or to make a point. Please put up your hand or unmute and speak now. I'm going to give it a few seconds because I do have another point I want to make. Anybody going, comments, questions? Well, while you pluck up courage, I'm going to just make another point quickly, Caradee. It's interesting when you look at heat waves in defining what a heat wave is and what it's relative to. And this would count, I guess, for all extreme events. And I was recently at a conference about the marine environment where marine heat waves were a big deal. And it is very interesting in the discussion around how we define these things, because statistical definitions don't always hit the mark. And one of the problems is that it might not be a statistically significant event from a climatological point of view, but it could still have a huge impact.
Yeah.
And so defining what you mean really needs to be carefully thought through. Do you have a comment on that?
Yes, I do. And I can see that my colleague Katlego from South African Weather Service is with us today as well. So Katlego may want to jump in and assist me, because I don't know off by heart the definition that the South African Weather Service uses for a heat wave, but it is a calculation based on the temperatures of a specific place. And it's when the temperature is so many degrees above the something over so many days across the typical month, something like that. Katlego, you can correct me, but it's roughly something like that. And that's usually what meteorological services use for the calculation of whether it's extremely hot or a heat wave. So in the public health space, there's a lot of work being done using epidemiology to try and better understand the actual health conditions that are associated with specific temperature thresholds. So this means that we're trying to create concentration response functions or exposure response functions relating temperature exposure to a particular outcome. And in South Africa, there's been some work done where we've used the outcome of mortality, in other words, people dying because it's so hot, and that's from all-cause mortality, and at which temperatures that may be the case. And what's tricky about this is that one can imagine that if we think about Durban on the coast, where it's very, very humid and hot, that's a different type of calculation required with humidity and temperature compared to up on the Highveld, where it's much drier and humidity is less of a concern, except when it's rainy. And so it's not as simple calculation as necessarily just using the temperatures of a place. I think there's more to it, relative humidity being one. There's some other metrics that South African Weather Service are now measuring as well, which could also be useful in terms of their biometeorology. And yeah, so the work that we've been doing has been looking at mortality. The MRC specifically is mortality. And then we're looking at it's in fact the range in temperature rather than the extreme. Because when somebody has to physiologically adjust from a very cool temperature to an extremely hot temperature in a short space of time, the risk to health can be greater, especially for people with pre-existing diseases. But just to add that when we do those studies, we don't include people with pre-existing diseases during a heat wave event who then pass away. We actually remove those people because it's called the harvesting effect, because those people were likely to have passed away anyway. We're trying to find those who were more likely to die because of the increased heat.
Thank you. I'm going to carry on conversing with you, Caradee, unless somebody else puts up their hand for a few more minutes, if you don't mind. When you were speaking now, I was thinking about Cliff. Hello, Cliff. Let me make my point, and then I'm going to let you talk. You were talking about this attribution approach, or at least some evidentiary approach, an impact approach. I was just thinking about the excess death idea during COVID, where I suppose the excess deaths were assumed to be attributed to COVID, and that gave us a better picture of the impact of COVID. So I imagine that similarly, one could look at excess deaths or excess morbidity of some kind during these events. And let me just throw in there that, just drawing from the marine environment again, it's not just heat waves, it's also cold snaps, and extreme events are also attributable to climate variability, climate change, which we don't often see in South Africa, although averages changes in the cold seasons. But sometimes, like in North America, we have these events where we get these huge swirls of cold air that come down into North America, which make things a lot colder than normal. And then, again, from the marine environment, what we have are thermal fluctuations, which is not so much the extent of the change of temperature, but the rate of change of temperature, which is a factor in the ecosystem. I'm not sure if this applies here. Okay, so those are my points. Please respond if you need to, Caradee, and then I'll ask Cliff to come in. Thanks.
I'll just say that the work that's been done to assess the relationship between temperature, extreme cold and extreme heat, which had a specific definition you'd have to look up in that manuscript, and I said it was 3.4%. 3% was due to extreme cold and 0.4% was due to extreme heat. So for a generally relatively mild to warm country like South Africa, we were actually seeing more impact from cold in terms of mortality than heat. But Cliff, I'm happy to talk to you. Hello.
Hello, Cliff. Please take the floor.
Yeah, thank you, nephew, and thank you, Caradee, for the presentation. My network is a bit unstable, but I just want to ask a question. You talked about heat and its impact on outdoor workers. I just want to know your opinion, or if there are any studies that have already been done in South Africa that look at the impact of heat on outdoor workers who are working in a polluted environment. It can be those who work on the streets who are polluted to air pollution from vehicles, or those who are working, say, on farms who are exposed to pesticides. So are there any studies that have looked at that, looking at the relationship? Does heat worsen the impact of pollutants, or do the pollutants worsen the impact of heat? Thank you.
Thanks. That's a really, really interesting question, Cliff. My immediate response would be to go and Google it in Google Scholar or look it up in PubMed. I don't unfortunately have the information to hand. I do know that studies have been done to look at outdoor workers' exposure to heat. And usually you will be focusing on a specific group of outdoor workers. So, for example, construction workers on road construction. And there you know that they have the risk of exposure to tar. And tar is actually also something that can cause skin cancer, interestingly. So I know about that study. There was some work done in Uppington for a study called Hot Haps. That was quite a long time ago, and they were looking at people working on roads. Then there's also been work done in mines, open cast mines, looking at outdoor workers and workers on the macadamia nut farms up in the northern parts of Limpopo. But in all of those instances, I'm not aware, and someone can correct me, whether there's been a dual look at the risk of heat stress related impacts together with air pollution related impacts. It would be quite interesting to do that. Of course, you would want to do some form of personal monitoring of air pollution. And that's usually tricky because those instruments are costly or cumbersome to the individual, but not impossible to do. And there's now wearables with those kinds of things. So yeah, that would make a really interesting study.
Thank you, Cliff and Caradee. Are there any other questions or comments from the floor? I see Katlego, please.
Yes, thanks, Caradee, for the great presentation. For me, it's just to comment, Neville, to say I'm really happy that Caradee is putting emphasis on extreme heat, because it's not always the case that we will reach and meet the criteria that is given for heat wave, because it says that the conditions should be persistent for more than 3 days. You see. So during that whole 3 days, we are having people who are dying, even if it's just 2 days, you are having people that are being impacted every time. And it's unfortunate that even how we are recording, or our hospital or Department of Health is recording this information, it's very difficult for us to actually track. So more emphasis and more focus should be on extreme heat, which is what we need to be looking at, because it's not all the time that we're gonna be able to meet that criteria, which is a little bit, I think, is too much. We're gonna be missing a lot of things. So people should be really focusing on extreme heat, those conditions whereby you have high temperatures, high humidity, very low wind speed. So we should be putting more work on that. That way we'll be able to assist our people. And I just pray that the focus become really on that extreme heat on its own, apart from this definition, because sometimes it can really deceive us and also just divert the focus on the research. That's all. Thank you, Katlego.
I mean, I think that's I want to respond to that, because I think it's very important to point out that, you know, we can define things from a meteorological or climatological. If we start at the other side, which is the impact side, and say, well, why are people dying? And is it related? You know, do you have excess deaths on this date in this place? Why is that? And relate that back to the temperatures, and you'll know better what the thresholds are to start seeing excess deaths, even if it's for less than the climatologically defined period. And I think it's a really important approach, and that's what the whole idea of the National Framework for Climate Services is trying to do, is to try and understand things from a sectoral point of view, and then get the observations associated, the climate observations associated. Caradee, do you want to add anything to that?
No, I just want to say to Katlego, we must make sure that when we look at our climate change and health indicators that we're working on with the Department of Environment and Department of Health, that we've worded it in that way and that we haven't just focused on heat waves. So that's something for us to bear in mind when we get together again on one of those meetings.
Very good, a very good outcome of this workshop.
Thank you.
And
maybe just a last comment to say that the WMO is actually looking into that, because we had a forum with them just last month, and there were debate on actually the heat wave definition. But I'm glad that many countries were like, please, it's not the focus. Just get rid of that. It's not the focus, the definition, and how, because obviously it's been defined differently, you know, everywhere around the world, and they wanted to actually have a standard. But then at least the debate actually was swayed to say, hey, just leave the heat wave definition. There's no need to even touch the heat wave definition. Let's look at the impacts and how each country is different. And each country have people who have been acclimatized differently. So let's look into that and do more research with that. Thanks, bye.
Yeah, you see, Katlego, for me, that's because you're having a conversation with a particular group of people who see the world from a meteorological point of view. If you spoke to the WHO or the joint office between the WHO and WMO, you might have had a different conversation. And that's why this conversation is so important, precisely that. I want to bring it to a conclusion, if I may. Just to remind everybody that COP is on the go right now. The Lancet published its update on climate and health just a few days or weeks ago, which you really should look at on climate and health. I think in anticipation of this COP meeting, a big announcement was made, at least I've only seen the headlines in the news, about a really significant tranche of funding committed by the so-called rich nations to South Africa for our just transition. So there's movement, I think, some movement. I don't know if that means we're going to save ourselves, but either way. But I think that the place of climate and health and leadership, such as we've seen from Caradee, is critical. It's really critical. And these conversations, as you've just witnessed, is very productive. So, Caradee, thank you very, very much for your excellent input and continued excellent contribution to all of the work we do. I'm going to finish by reminding everybody, if you don't mind, I'm just going to quickly share my screen and show you this. Oh gosh, which window it is. Let me just do it another way. I'm just going to show the whole screen and then take a embarrass myself. But we are holding this side event at the Global Change Conference at the end of January. We are calling for papers, a particular side event. There is potential funding for speakers that want to come. We are going to try and get some input from some people. Caradee is already speaking independently of the session, so this is a little bit out of date. But we do want to invite people to come and present their work on climate and health and help us discuss this idea of developing a research alliance for climate and health in South Africa. So I can't put this in the chat, it appears. So what I will do is just put my email here in the chat. And if you haven't received this announcement, then please email. I will send you a copy of this announcement. All right, so that's it. I'm just going to ask Inga if she has anything she wants to add before we close.
Thanks, Neville. No, nothing from me. Just a reminder that just keep an eye on your emails for the seminar next week, and then we'll start again next year. Okay, great.
Pravesh, anything?
No, nothing further from my side either, Neville. But just to thank Carolee for the presentation. It was really nice and very informative. So thanks very much.
Thank you. This is recorded and we will put the recording somewhere. I have a channel, we maybe have some other channels on YouTube so we can spread the word. So with that, thanks again to Caradee and thanks for everybody who attended, and we shall call it right now. Thank you. And
Thanks, Neville. Thanks, Inga. Goodbye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you for a great presentation. Bye.